If you would like to follow along in the YouVersion Bible app on your phone or tablet, you can do that. Open that app, go in the menu, go to Events. It says North Augusta Church. That's us. So those are our notes. I'm going to do something a little uncharacteristic for me, at least less characteristic, in that I'm going to start in the Old Testament this morning. I'm big fan of Jesus, go there a lot. I'm going to wind up in the New Testament, but I'm going to start in the Old Testament with a pretty odd story. In the Old Testament, you run across the story of a guy named Balaam. And Balaam is fascinating for a number of reasons. One of them is Balaam is identified as a prophet of God from Midian. Now, there are lots of prophets in the Old Testament, so that by itself doesn't stand out. I mean, it's a pretty good gig, but what's really confusing about it is that Balaam has never heard of the Israelites. Like, doesn't know who they are. That comes up because Balaam, who's known as a prophet of God, talks to God every day, is summoned by the Moabite king Balak to place a curse on the Israelites so that they can be defeated. Balaam says, all right, well, pretty good deal. Let me go ask God. So he goes and asks God about placing a curse on these Israelites that he's never heard of. And God says no. Balaam goes back to the king and says, well, I checked with God. God says no. And so Balak offers him a better deal, more money. And so Balaam goes back to God and explains, okay, I get that you were against this, but he offered more cash. At which point, a seemingly frustrated God says, all right, you go ahead and do whatever it is you want to do here, but I'm going to go ahead and warn you that you're only going to be able to do what I tell you to. Like most people who set themselves on a course of action, whether it's a good course of action or not, he runs this through some kind of filter in his head where he says, got it, God's on board. So he goes back to Balak and said, hey, I talked to God about it, and for more money, we're in. So, that all leads us to one of the weirdest passages in the entire Bible, and let me be clear, that's really, really saying something. Pick up, if you will, in Numbers chapter 22. Numbers chapter 22, and I'm going to start in verse 21. I've given you a setup. Here's what happens next. So the next morning, Balaam got up, saddled his donkey, and started off with the Moabite officials. But God was angry that Balaam was going, so he sent the angel of the Lord to stand in the road to block his way. As Balaam and two servants were riding along, Balaam's donkey saw the angel of the Lord standing in the road with a drawn sword in its hand. The donkey bolted off the road into a field, but Balaam beat it and turned it back into the road. Then the angel of the Lord stood at a place where the road narrowed between two vineyard walls. When the donkey saw the angel of the Lord, it tried to squeeze by and crushed Balaam's foot against the wall. So Balaam beat the donkey again. Then the angel of the Lord moved farther down the road and stood in a place too narrow for the donkey to get by at all. This time, when the donkey saw the angel, it lay down under Balaam in a fit of rage. Balaam beat the animal again with his staff. Then the Lord gave the donkey the ability to speak. What have I done to you that deserves your beating me 3 times? It asked Balaam. And here's where it goes from weird to truly absurd. And don't misunderstand me, it's supposed to come across that way. You have made me look like a fool, Balaam shouted. If I had a sword with me, I would kill you. But I am the same donkey you've ridden all of your life, the donkey answered. Have I ever done anything like this before? No, Balaam admitted. Then the Lord opened Balaam's eyes, and he saw the angel of the Lord standing in the roadway with a drawn sword in his hand. Balaam bowed his head and fell face down to the ground before him. "Why did you beat your donkey all those times?" the angel of the Lord demanded. "Look, I have come to block your way because you are stubbornly resisting me. 3 times the donkey saw me and shied away. Otherwise, I would have certainly killed you by now and spared the donkey." Okay. A couple of things about the story. Balaam sets out. Now, Balaam has asked God. God said no. Balaam goes back and says, "But God, we got a better deal." God says, "All right. You're clearly not listening to me. You go do what you want to do, but I'm going to tell you when you get there, you're only going to do what I want you to do." Balaam interprets that as God's on board. So he gets up in the morning with the Moabite delegation, a couple servants. He gets on his favorite donkey, I'm assuming, and he starts heading towards the place where he's supposed to do this Israelite cursing. God dispatches an angel to stop him because Balaam is so dense. The angel stands in the road. The donkey can see it. Apparently, it's a bit like Quantum Leap, if you remember that, where animals and children can see it. The donkey sees it. Balaam does not see it. The donkey bolts off into a field. Balaam, not really being an example of good animal care, beats the donkey with a staff. The donkey goes back in the road, sees the angel again, rams Balaam into a wall. He beats the donkey again because that worked so well the first time. And then eventually the angel positions itself where they can't get by, and the donkey, instead of running him into a wall, just lays down under him, which is hilarious if you think about it. Balaam starts beating the donkey again. God gives the donkey the ability to talk. Now, I want you to understand. Yes, it is Eddie Murphy's voice in my head when I watch this, ever since I've seen Shrek. When I read this, that's how I hear it. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think it adds to the story. Now, I'm not going to do an impression. Just because I haven't worked that one up. Maybe a different time. There are a few that I can do, but that's not one of them. God gives the donkey the ability to talk. I want you to understand, it's not the case where it's a little unusual for you to run into a talking donkey, but it happens. They're not used to talking donkeys. Talking donkeys are exactly as rare as they are today. Maybe more rare because they didn't have the animated movies. But Balaam is so enraged, and this may be the most relatable part of this story. Balaam is so enraged that when the donkey starts talking to him, instead of going, "Wait a minute, that's a talking donkey," he just argues with the donkey. By the way, the donkey wins. Their argument is, the donkey goes, "Hey, why are you beating me? You made me look like a fool." The donkey counters by saying, "Hey, let me ask you something. Have I ever done this kind of thing before?" And Balaam stops and gets contemplative, although still not dawning on him that he's talking to a donkey. "Well, no, that's a good point, donkey. You haven't ever done this before." God opens his eyes. He sees the angel of the Lord. He freaks out, suddenly sort of appreciative of the donkey, and bows down and apologizes and apologizes and apologizes. Now, somehow he still gets through, and there's more to the story, but there's a couple things I want you to observe here. Number one, Balaam is a prophet of God who's never heard of the Israelites. Do you have a good explanation for that? No, I do not. Except for this, which I don't offer as a good explanation, just as commentary. The Old Testament appears to be telling us a story. It's telling us the story of God and his chosen people, the Israelites. Now, because that's the story it's telling, it's not all that interested in other stories. But every once in a while, you get another story that crosses over. For example, there's that time when I believe it's Abraham runs into this prophet of God out in the wilderness. They talk about God. They have some kind of ceremony involving bread and wine. The guy's name is Melchizedek. And he goes on his way. And you don't get backstory about how Melchizedek knows God. You don't get backstory for why Melchizedek thinks bread and wine are very important symbols of God, which is weird since that doesn't really even get explained in general until the New Testament. And you go, I would really like some backstory on that. And the Bible goes, yeah, I bet you would. And doesn't give it. Here you get Balaam, a prophet of God who's never heard of the Israelites. The Israelites who have this relationship with God, who are given the law, we're given the Ten Commandments, we're given all this stuff. And then you got Balaam, who's a prophet of God who talks to God every day, never heard of the Israelites. How can that be? What's his backstory? Don't know. Doesn't say. Not given. But here's what I want you to notice about it. Balaam, even though he's a prophet of God who talks to God every day, doesn't appear to really stand for anything. He's a prophet of God, but he isn't tuned in enough to know about God's people or what God is doing with and through them. He also, if you'll notice, even though he talks to God, he doesn't listen real good. Because God's quite clear, but he stubbornly insists on hearing what he wants to hear. Now, I'm sure you don't know anybody like that. I'm sure you've never been anybody like that, but apparently it happens with people sometimes. Because of his lack of conviction, he's easily swayed by things like power, prestige, and money. Let me say that again. Because he doesn't really stand for anything, because of his lack of conviction, he's very easily swayed by power, prestige, and money. Meaning, there's a guy who calls him, who's kind of a big deal, who says, here's what I want you to do. You got this relationship with God, we've heard about it. There are these people, we're kind of freaked out about them because they're coming through the land. They're taking lots of land. They don't really seem to be that impressive, but they're doing really well. We're a little worried about it. Looks like they're going to come through our area, so if you could get up and curse those people in the name of your God, that seems to be effective. We can make it worth your while. He goes and asks God about it. God says, no, not those people, I'm doing a thing. Goes back and reports a failure, is offered more money, and Balaam is so poorly informed about the God that he serves, contains so few convictions about it, that he thinks more money is persuasive. So he goes and explains it to God as if it's going to be persuasive. Hey, God, I know you said you were against this, but he said he'd give us more money, and I in case you've forgotten, I really like money. Do what you got to do, man. It's not going to work out exactly like you think. Now, what ends up happening is that Balaam goes up on this mountain. Don't worry, Balak, I'm here. I'm going to do the thing. Even after the incident with the angel and stuff, he's like, I'm going to do the thing. He gets up and he opens his mouth to pronounce the curse over the Israelites, which you can see down below him. And instead, what comes out is a curse of Balak's armies and a blessing for the Israelites. Happens a couple of times. Balak is not happy. But again, God was honest. The interesting question about it to me is, here you have a guy who honestly appears to be in conversation with God all the time. He appears to be talking to God. He doesn't have the Israelite story, but he is communicating with God regularly, to the point that we get some of God's dialogue. When God talking back to him, he doesn't just think he's talking to God, he's talking to God. So how could he miss the point of God this badly? How could he miss it when God actually tells him specific things and he somehow twists them into what he wanted to do anyway? The answer is quite easily, because we're tempted to do that all the time, and sometimes it's successful. Oh, it's not right. but we tend to be real successful at it when we try. And I do think that it's tied to his lack of conviction, to his lack of buying into God's purposes. I think it's tied to, he almost seems to be, his relationship with God almost seems to be mercenary. Meaning he's in the relationship with God for what he can get out of it. And when it doesn't go the way that he thinks he prefers, instead of being shaped and challenged and contemplative about it, he just pushes harder until he can do some mental gymnastics to fit his plan into the opposite thing that God has told him. Turn, if you will, to Ephesians chapter 4, starting in verse 11. Because I think Balaam is a cautionary tale as much as it's anything else. I think it's a cautionary tale about not having enough convictions, about trying to use God as a commodity, about trying to use God to just enhance our own bottom line rather than buying into God's actual vision. And as it's a cautionary tale, then what we've got to ask ourselves when we read stories like that is, okay, how do I keep from going that way then? If it can happen to a guy like Balaam who talks to God every day, then how do I keep it from happening to me? Ephesians chapter 4, starting in verse 11. To the Ephesian church, Paul says, "So Christ himself gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, and pastors and teachers to equip his people for works of service so that the body of Christ may be built up until we reach unity in the faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God and become mature, attaining the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. Then we will no longer be like infants, tossed back and forth by the waves and blown here and there by every wind of teaching and by the cunning and craftiness of people in their deceitful scheming. Instead, speaking the truth in love, we will grow to become in every respect the mature body of him who is the head, that is Christ. From him, the whole body, joined and held together by every supporting ligament, grows and builds itself up in love as each part does its work." So Paul to the Ephesian church, and again, Ephesians is written to the Ephesian church, but most scholars believe that this one, even more than the others, in a way is meant to be a circular kind of letter that they pass around. So it's initially addressed to the Ephesians, but it's meant for a wider audience. And he tells them, okay, so Christ himself gave the equipped people to be evangelists, pastors, prophets, teachers. And he equipped his people for works of service. That there's something tied into the identity of those who would follow Jesus, of those who would be Christians, of those who would be part of the church, that has to do with what you're geared for is works of service done in love. That's part of the controlling idea. That's part of your identity of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And if you are not doing that, if we are not doing that, if we are not seeking opportunities to do that, we're missing something. If we bought into a version of Christianity that doesn't lend itself, that doesn't naturally on-ramp us into works of service for others, we've missed a big part of what it means to be Christian. If it doesn't make more sense out of serving other people, then we may have misunderstood the whole deal. See, there are versions I hear of Christianity that sound a whole lot more like what Balaam's relationship with God appeared to be. Having these conversations, they're very uplifting and edifying for him. But it appears to be for what he can get out of it. It appears to be for how he can advance his own agenda. Paul envisioned us as this body of Christ where every part is doing its work, and that work is defined as service for others done in love. That we're all gifted sort of differently, and that God kind of deploys us together to be this body, and the thing that sort of ties that together is works of service done in love. Now you got to ask yourself, and you're going to have to speculate a little bit, but if part of his idea of who he was as a follower of God, as a prophet of God, was tied into serving others in love, you wonder how compelling the offer from the king would have been. You wonder how easily swayed he would have been. You wonder how much he would have missed the point of what God was saying, or how much he might have actually got it. In his book, The Great Omission, Dallas Willard says, "But spirituality in many Christian circles has simply become another dimension of Christian consumerism. We've generated a body of people who consume Christian services and think that is Christian faith. Consumption of Christian services replaces obedience to Christ, and spirituality is one more thing to consume." That's the temptation for churches. To fall into the culture, to our consumer culture, of being just a purveyor of religious goods and services, or you come where you can get the best deal, most bang for your buck. And so you ask yourself all kinds of questions about, does this have what I prefer here, and what I prefer here, and what I prefer here, and is this what God is doing for me, and what did I get out of this? And look, I'm not saying you should never ask questions. If you've been listening to me at all over the time I've been here, you know I'm not saying that. What I am saying is, Christianity is fundamentally a transformative exercise, enterprise. It's something that you get into that changes you. But if you're not careful, if you don't check your allegiances every once in a while, what you wind up doing is, instead of allowing God to form you into the image of Christ, which he gives you the ability to allow him to do or not, instead of opening yourself up to being formed into the image of Christ, like we are the clay and he is the potter, we do a phenomenal job of forming God in our own image, of creating a God who's a bigger, better version of us that surprisingly thinks all the stuff that we think is good and bad, that justifies the things that we want and demonizes those who disagree with us. If your reading of the Bible, if your engagement with Christian spirituality does not challenge you, does not shape you, does not poke you at places where you're a little sensitive, you're not doing it right. As those who are not equal to the infinite and omnipotent God, for the rest of our lives, we will be changing and learning and growing. Commitment to Christianity is a commitment to change and transformation for the rest of your life, period. It isn't, okay, so you got it all down? You became a Christian like 2 weeks ago. You should have this stuff down. You pass the test on Judgment Day. It'll be Scantron, number 2 pencil. If you can get all the answers right, that's all we're really looking for. No, it's about changing you into the image of Christ, and that's going to take you in a certain direction. All the fruit of the Spirit are relational terms. They're about the way that you interact with other people. Those who follow Jesus should end up resembling Jesus. You got 4 accounts of how he interacts with other people. I still contend that a fascinating study, maybe one day I'll sort of do it in a public way, but a fascinating study is to look at who Jesus interacts with and how he interacts with them. Because you're given quite a bit of information. Who is he incredibly patient with? Who does he get angry with, and why? Because it's not always the things that you would guess. To the degree that we make church one more consumer enterprise that instead of challenging us just makes us comfortable is the point that we have missed the point of church. To be clear, part of our calling is to incarnate the message of God, the gospel, into the time and place that we find ourselves. And that means that we're constantly doing the work of translation and figuring out how do we say this to these people in this time and place? How do we engage and connect people with God who wants to connect to them? And that means sometimes in some places it's going to look very different. But the key is, are we doing that? Are we making changes? Are we making decisions based on what makes us comfortable or what helps us in the accomplishment of our mission? Because I'm going to tell you, those two things are often going to be at odds with each other. James chapter 2, starting in verse 14. What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds? This is, by the way, a rhetorical question. Rhetorical questions have implied answers. He's not really asking. He's going to make a run of rhetorical questions, and the way that works is they have similar implied answers. That's why you stack them like this. What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds? Implied answer, none. Can such a faith save them? Implied answer, no. Suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm and well fed, but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? Implied answer, it's not any good. In the same way, faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead. But someone will say, you have faith and I have deeds. Show me your faith without your deeds, and I'll show you my faith by what I do. You believe that there is one God? Good. Even the demons believe that and shudder. So, he starts talking about this debate they're apparently having. That they're saying, look, we're saved by faith, not by what we do. And there's a seed of a good idea in there. Because a lot of the Bible is dedicated to the idea that God does the saving, that you can't save yourself, that it's by grace. But here's the difference, and again, I think it's the same difference that you see in Balaam. If you enter into that arrangement as a consumer just looking for what you can get for yourself, that affects the way that you interpret it to the point that what Paul's saying here doesn't make a ton of sense. If you buy into that God saved us so that we could join him in his process of reconciliation, that he saved us that he gave us grace in order that we might participate with him in what he's doing in the world, that shapes your reading of things too. And what Paul says here makes tons of sense. Apparently they're having a debate. Are you saved by faith or are you saved by what you do? And James, if you'll allow me to paraphrase, looks back at them, knows their debate, and writes them a letter that basically says, that's the dumbest question I've ever heard. Again, it's a paraphrase. Am I saved by faith or am I saved by what I do? James appears to be saying, help me understand this faith that you have that doesn't affect your actions. Help me understand this faith that you have that doesn't shape your behavior in any way. Help me process the definition of a faith that has no impact whatsoever on what you actually do in your life. Give me a really, really good argument about how you can have faith that's not reflected in your deeds, James says, and I'll show you my faith by what I do. Because my actions would not make any sense if I didn't have faith. James doesn't understand a kind of faith, a kind of trust in God, a belief in God's good on his promises. Somebody who has bought into the way of Jesus, not because it's a really good deal, but because they actually believe in it. Not just they believe it, they believe in it. They think it is the way. They buy that unconditional love comes out on top, that grace comes out on top, that forgiveness comes out on top. Even when evidence seems to be to the contrary. Those people behave in a certain way in the world that doesn't make any sense, and you don't really do if you don't believe it. So James says, explain to me this faith that you have that doesn't affect your actions. This thing that you can still call faith that still looks at almost every situation in the world and says, that would be nice in a perfect world, but you got to be smart. Really impressive philosophical arguments about the faith without works thing, guys, he seems to be saying, but I think I'll just show you my faith by what I do. Because I can't imagine having faith that wouldn't affect my actions. I can't imagine having faith that wouldn't affect my behavior. And by the way, what were his examples? Let's say you have a brother or sister who doesn't have any food or clothes, and you see them out on the street, and you say, be warm and well fed. Sure, that's a really polite greeting. But you do nothing about their physical needs. What good have you done then? Do you think they're going to write that down? Oh, I should be warm and well fed. I hadn't thought of that. Thanks. No, they're quite aware. If you have the ability to do something about it and you don't, what good have you done? Implied answer? None. And James says, yeah, faith is like that. Let's say you can make a real smart argument about how it's all this internal reality. I still don't get a faith that doesn't affect the way that you behave and act in the world and the decisions that you make. Are you saved by those actions? No. But frankly, you're not saved by reaching a certain level of faith either. Remember? The Bible at a certain point says, hey, if you got faith like a mustard seed, that's enough. We can work with that. Matter of fact, your faith appears to be in the ability of God to pull the whole thing off. Your faith appears to be in the ability of God to reconcile you to himself through Jesus. So it's still in God's ability. So what do people who believe that behave like in the world? In his book, The Divine Conspiracy, Dallas Willard says, more than any other single thing, in any case, the practical irrelevance of actual obedience to Christ accounts for the weakened effect of Christianity in the world today, with its increasing tendency to emphasize political and social action as the primary way to serve God. It also accounts for the practical irrelevance of the Christian faith to individual character development and overall personal sanity and well-being. Divine Conspiracy is a fantastic book. You should pick that up sometime. Willard points to this reality where he says, we've sort of neutered the gospel. we kind of cut off its power because we don't open ourselves up to the gospel changing us. We present it like a deal. Hey, have you heard about this deal? You do this, all you got to do is this, and then you get all these benefits. Are there blessings and benefits to being a Christian? Yeah. That's not a trick question. Yeah, there are. Thing is, I don't ever actually quite see it pitched that way in the Bible. It's pitched as, come follow me. It's pitched as, do you buy into this way of being in the world? Do you buy in God's dream for the world? Do you buy in where God says the world is going? Do you buy into things like unconditional love, self-sacrifice? Do you buy into this? Do you want to be a part of it? Those are two very different pitches, and I'll argue that your understanding of what you're doing is very different depending on which one of those things you say yes to. A Christianity that doesn't change us into the image of Christ. A Christianity that isn't good news doesn't make a lot of sense to the world and isn't that compelling, and we shouldn't be surprised by it. A Christianity that does care about doing good for the world because it's good, not in a transactional way, but because it's good, because we actually believe in that dream, because we're trying to reflect who God is, who was good to us while we were still sinners. Well, that gets some attention. One that's actually transformative and doesn't appear to just be for the benefits of members, but actually is good for the world. Well, that's compelling. What the world doesn't need is one more social club. One more insider-outsider social club that motivates by exclusion, that only has benefits for members. Yeah, the world's got plenty of those things. What the world doesn't need is one more predictable voting block for politicians and political parties. That's so cliche, it's worse than threatening, it's boring. It's sad. It's pathetic. And it's not worth the gospel or the death and resurrection of Jesus. What the world needs is something that's truly transformative, because that's what was offered. And God help us. God forgive us if we ever tried to turn it into something other than that. Let's finish up in Luke chapter 6. Starting in verse 46, I'm going to read from the Voice translation just so it's a little bit fresh in your ears. What good is it to mouth the words, Lord, Lord, if you don't live by my teachings, Jesus said. What matters is that you come to me, hear my words, and actually live by them. If you do that, you'll be like the man who wanted to build a sturdy house. He dug down deep and anchored his foundation to solid rock. During a violent storm, the floodwaters slammed against the house, but they couldn't shake it because of solid craftsmanship. It was built upon rock. On the other hand, if you hear my teachings but don't put them into practice, you'll be like the careless builder who didn't bother to build a foundation under his house. Floodwaters barely touched that pathetic house, and it crashed into ruins in the mud. And the last passage ended with what I think is kind of hilarious but biting kind of statement. It says, it's talking about the faith versus works thing. He says, wait, you believe that Jesus is the Son of God? Well, that's good. That's true, but you do realize that the demons believe that, right? You do understand that they believe it more than you do. That they actually venture into knowledge on it and they shudder because they understand the power of Jesus. So, you believe that Jesus is the Son of God. You want a cookie? I'm talking about faith that actually affects your actions, not you getting the answer right on the test. These are Jesus' words here. What good is it to mouth the words, Lord, Lord, if you don't live by his teachings? Again, rhetorical questions. None. What good does it do if you talk to God every day, but don't put any of God's teachings into action? Didn't do any good for Balaam. Ain't doing any good for us. What good is it to identify Jesus as Lord? Say all the right things, sing the songs. Keep your car on the Christian radio station in your car so that you can sing along praise songs as you drive around instead of whatever else is out there. But you never put God's teaching into action. What good does that do? Well, I guess it helps their advertisers, but in the big scheme of things, none. You go to church every Sunday instead of sleeping in. You sing the songs. You take notes. But it doesn't ever get around to affecting your behavior? What good is that? You know how this works. None. This is supposed to affect the way that you behave, not just as a matter of you staying out of trouble and not doing any of the things labeled bad. It actually is calling you to a different way of living where you're living for things that are good, where you're doing things, making decisions, taking actions that are good, that are in harmony with what God is doing in the world in the pursuit of his dream for the world. Were you saved from sin? Absolutely, but you were also saved to partner with God in his dream of reconciliation for the world. Again, in The Divine Conspiracy, Dallas Willard says, individual Christians still hear Jesus say, whoever hears these words of mine and does them is like those intelligent people who build their houses upon rock, standing firm against every pressure of life. How life-giving would it be if their understanding of the gospel allowed them to simply reply, I will do them. I will find out how. I will devote my life to it. That is the best life strategy I've ever heard of. And then go off to their fellowship and its teachers and into their daily life to learn how to live his kingdom as Jesus indicated was best. Again, you're not doing these things to save yourself. You're doing these things as those who are saved, who understand what was going on, who understand the point of it. It's not just about you or just about me. It's about God and his dream for the whole world. It's about us coming together and being the body of Christ together in the world. It's about us getting to partner with the infinite God in things that are better than we could come up with and that are beyond our skill sets, but still we're called to partner in because his power is shown in our weakness. The world doesn't need one more insider-outsider club, and I'm profoundly uninterested in it. The world needs to experience the body of Christ. The world needs to see God through those who would bear his image. The world needs to experience and hear good news by the people who actually believe in it. It's amazing to me that when you go through the Bible, you're constantly met with people who either, like Balaam, are a prophet of God, who actually ends up trying to do the opposite of what God wants him to do. The Pharisees and teachers of the law who, because you know the stories, we kind of cast as villains because they do end up standing in the way of God. But the problem is, these are people who actually did devote themselves to the study of Scripture, to very meticulous religious practices, to this particular God. And when this particular God shows up in human form in front of them, they not only miss the point of what he's doing, they actively oppose him in his name. And if we don't see those as cautionary tales, as we don't see those as there but for the grace of God go out, if we don't see those as a possibility to constantly guard against, You can wind up there so quick it'll make your head spin. We become suckers for those with prestige and power and money, who just pay us the right kind of attention to make us feel special and important. We retcon the Bible and Christianity to fit agendas other than God's. And we do it quite comfortably. But we don't have to. We were called to something a lot bigger and better than that. And yes, it is more than just finding ways to serve people in love, but it is not less. There is no version of it that doesn't involve that and that isn't characterized by that. There is no version of Christian maturity that gets increasingly selfish and cares about other people less. And one of the things that I love about this church, truly, honestly, Dana and I talk about this all the time, is that it is one of the most authentically loving places that is captured by the idea of serving people. We often deploy that when an emergency comes up that we weren't expecting, but the way that we mobilize, the way that people want to care and want to help and want to figure out the best way to actually help is astounding to me. And I've seen much larger, better resourced churches who stumble over that a lot more. And I'm grateful for that, and part of what I'm saying is there's something good and true and holy about that, and we need to lean into it more. Because one thing that I know that happens when you do that is that it draws you closer to each other and it draws you closer to God every time. You mean it's never frustrating? I did not say that. It's never hard? I didn't say that. It never hurts? You never feel like your efforts are wasted? No, I didn't say either one of those things. I'm saying it's good. I'm saying God can be found there. I'm saying life as it was meant to be lived can be found there. But we're going to have to overcome some of our own impulses to get there. So may the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace as you trust in him, so that you may overflow with hope by the power of the Holy Spirit. And the church said together.